Hui! Aloha ahi ahi kako. It's Kumumaka Herod of the Mele Foundation. I'm the executive director, and I'm so happy to be in the presence of wherever you are. Thank you for tuning in to our culture presentation evening this tonight, titled E Mauana Kapuana Mele Inoa, continuing Mele Inoa traditions. We are so excited, and I'm so happy to have this wonderful individual, a friend to many in Hawaii, and she has put together an array of wonderful information for us this evening. So I hope you enjoy. I just have a little bit of announcement. First of all, it's our 36th annual Kauai Mokiana Festivals. And so I would like to say mahalo kia kua for bringing us this far, as well as mahalo to Uncle Nathan Kalama, who's one of the founders of the Kauai Mokiana Festivals, as well as his friends who created the group Mele, or the musical group Mele. And they are Larry Duhai Longsad and Eko Lupunui. So mahalo to them, as well as their ohana for just inspiring people around the world. Please check out our various postings on Mele Foundation and the Kauai Mokiana Festival's Facebook pages for previous posting or updated information. Please comment where you are from, and that would be great because this will help us with providing statistics for reporting purposes and seeking funding opportunities in the future. We're also connected with Kanaya Okana, Office of Hawaiian Affairs, Hawaii Pono'i Coalition, and Oiwi TV. Mahalo nui to these entities for allowing us to cross-post to reach out to more people in the world. So mahalo nui. It's a tradition for many of us here in Hawaii that we begin with a pule. So please enjoy join me, Kalamai, join me in our prayer time. We're going to do Ho'onani Kamakua, followed by our state anthem, or Hawaii anthem, Hawaii Pono'i. Pulikako. Ho'onani Kamakua mau, ke ki me ka uhane no, ke akua mau ho mai ka ipu, ko ke iau, ko ke lau. Amen. Hawaii pono'i nanai komoi kalani ali ke ali makualani e kameha meha e na kaua e pale me ka ihe makualani e kameha meha e na kaua e pale me ka ihe. Aloha ke akua. Mahalo nui. Okay, so now you can relax. Make sure that you have a really nice drink like water or tea. You can have coffee as well. And then also some pupus to enjoy. This special guest that we have She is just awesome. And so I don't want you to go and use the restroom or go take care of Kuleana while she's sharing her mana'o. So I want you guys to do that now before I introduce her to you. And then so that you can just engage and enjoy and be encouraged. At this time, I would like to say mahalo nui to our sponsors, the County of Kauai Office of Economic Development, Hawaii Tourism Authority, Trinet Kauai and A&B Properties, Kukui Ula Development, Hawaii Community Foundation, Office of Hawaiian Affairs, and Grand Pacific Resort Management. Special recognition to Kauai Mayor Derek Kawakami and Kahula Hoa staff of Japan, Endo, Kikuchi, Shuho, and Honu Kamera. So mahalo nui for those sponsors. I also wanted to say mahalo to our donors and volunteers and those that make Kauai Mokihana festivals possible so that we can reach everyone in the world. Mahalo. So our special guest resides from Kauai. She's from Kauai, born and raised here, and then she moved to Oahu for schooling, and of course now for work. Dr. Kualoha Ho'omanawa Nui, a Kanaka Oiwi, native Hawaiian, scholar, poet, artist, and Malama Aina advocate. She is a professor in the Department of English at the University of Hawaii at Manoa, specializing in traditional Hawaiian literature, including folklore and mythology, oceanic, Pacific literature, and indigenous perspectives on literacy. Our topic this evening is E Mauana ka Puana Mele Inoa, continuing Mele Inoa traditions, name songs that honor people, is a long-standing genre of Hawaiian poetry that goes back centuries. I am so honored to introduce to you all a wonderful best friend of my wife, Ivalani, which because of this pilina, she became my friend. So aloha, Dr. Kualoha Ho'omanawa Nui.
Aloha no.
Aloha! And you know what is so funny? Ya kualoha, hoaloha. There's so much aloha here in this place, including where you're from and where you're at and where I am as well.
Ew, that's right.
Aye. And so how are you doing?
I'm doing good. I wish I could come home, but COVID is keeping us all locked down where we are.
I know. And you know what would be good is if you did come home now, you could spend 14 days.
Exactly, at least 14 days.
Yeah. And hopefully you can, if you have to, and maybe you can work from home here.
Yeah, we'll see. I don't want to be exposed and inadvertently bring it to the island because you guys have been doing such a great job keeping it at bay.
Polale, polale. And so you know what? That's what it's all about, yeah? Hawaii is like that, where we malama ke kahi ke kahi.
Ew, exactly.
Aye. And so without further ado, please enjoy this special presentation with Dr. Kualoha Ho'omanawa Nui.
Oh, mahalo nui.
Yeah, ho'omau.
Okay. Aloha, awinala, or I guess it's ahi ahi now. Aloha ahi ahi kako. My name is Ku'aloha Ho'omanawa Nui, and I was actually born in Kailua on the island of Oahu and raised on Kauai, which is where my dad was partially raised, and lived there, have gone back and forth, came to Oahu for school. I majored in Hawaiian studies and then did a master's in Polynesian religion and then a PhD in English. And the focus between them all was Mo'olelo Hawaii, our traditional mo'olelo that includes Mele. And so when I was asked if I could present for Mokihana Festival this year virtually, I thought about the theme, which is looking at Ali'i, our beloved Ali'i. And I also thought about something that would be interesting to this audience that I could contribute. I have grown up mostly as a Paleola girl, did dance hula for a while with John Kaimikawa's Halau, um, have danced a little tiny bit with Maka's Halau, but more contributed with Mele for the Halau for other dancers and doing research. So I am currently co-writing an article for publication on this idea of continuity of culture through Mele and looking specifically at we call Naivi, which is the poetic devices. So the premise is that as we go along in time, there are certain things in cultures that change. Um, for example, we left behind human sacrifice when Christianity arrived in the islands in the early 19th century in 1820 when the first missionaries came. And that's not something I've ever heard anybody seriously advocate to bring back as a contemporary practice of Hawaiian culture. There's other things that we create and invent, new food items, for example, lomi salmon. It comes from the 19th century when the boats would come and go between Hawaii and the Northwest, and Alaskan or salmon from the Pacific Northwest became really common, and so that became part of our diets as well as new musical instruments like ukulele and even piano that's often used in hula awana. Things like kapakuiki or quilts that my grandmother and aunties are all very noted for, as well as their lauhala work, which of course is, very ancient. So we have a mix of what has come down over time that we keep and we treasure. Um, Arguably, Mele Inoa is one of them. We still practice that. It's a really popular and important genre of Hawaiian mele. And other things have uh, sort of fallen by the wayside and new things come up. So we're always a very dynamic culture that's reinventing and inventing and creating, which I think is really wonderful. So if we could get started with the slideshow, I picked just a couple mele with a theme, in part to show the continuity, but also the differences as we've gone along in time. So next slide, please. Okay, so we're just going to start with the real basics, right? Mele, when we talk about mele, we often think of a song or a chant. Some people say, well, mele is a song, oli is a chant. Other people say oli is a style of performing a mele. I happen to come from the belief that, as our kupuna said, "Ole pauka ike kahalau ho'okahi." Not all knowledge is contained in one school. So we have different interpretations, and I think that's completely fine. Um, and for this presentation, we're looking at mele as this idea of a poem, a chant, and a song. They're all doing the same kind of thing, uh, putting together thoughts that are very poetic, and meant to convey additional thought and feeling to whatever the subject of the mele is. And then more specifically, the mele inoa, which is a name chant or a name song composed to honor a person. And there's actually different kinds of specific categories as well. So for example, a kanikau or a lament is often composed when someone has passed away. And so that's a very specific type of mele inoa that honors a person in a different way from what we'll be talking about today. So next slide. So this word I mentioned earlier, meivi, was coined by Kumu Larry Kimura, who was at UH Manoa teaching Hawaiian language when I was there back in the 80s, and then moved to UH Hilo. And this is a newer word that he utilized to talk about the structure. of what we look at when we're looking at Mele. So Meivi comes from this idea of Mele plus Iwi, and it describes the traditional elements used by the Haku Mele or the composer to enhance the poetry of Mele. Now there are dozens upon dozens of Meivi, and I'm just going to go through a really small handful because I actually teach a class on this that's a whole semester. So we don't have a whole semester tonight. So we're just going to look at just a couple of Mele and a handful of these maybe. Next. Okay, so here's the examples we'll be looking at. Next. Of the maybe. Okay, so first is the idea of mo'okuahau or genealogy. Now, this is a really critical component of individual identity for Kanaka Oiwi, as well as other indigenous people, our Polynesian cousins, as well as beyond, right? Our ancestors, our kupuna, are very important to us and being able to recall and recount. So it connects us to our kupuna, our ohana, and then the larger lahui, which means both the community as well as the nation or the people. So we can think of lahui in all of those means. So mo'okuauhau is often somehow included in Mele Inoa and not always in the same way. Next, please. Okay, a koa is a term that describes dyads or complementary pairings of oppositional things that also go together, right? So the idea of pono or balance and harmony is when we have things that may be opposite but they go together. So some really common ones that we see in all kinds of mele would be night and day, male and female, sun and moon, um, Kane and Wahine, um, so on and so forth, right? East and west, Hikina Kala and Komohana Kala, right? The sunrise, the sunset. So this is always prevalent in Hawaiian Mele, and we see this in Mele Inoa as well. Okay, next. Okay, helu. Helu, we think of as to count, like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So it also means to list or to recount. This is an important strategy in oral culture that helps with memory. Instead of telling a whole story, we want to be able to list concisely in categories of information that can help us. So in looking at Hawaiian education overall and looking at this practice of helu, one of the things that I learned from different kumu is how we memorize categories is to go over by recounting or listing by helu. So for example, if we're talking about remembering lei flowers, we might start with a category of flowers and go around the room and have everybody say one type of flower. So like plumeria, hibiscus, roses, whatever you can think of until nobody can think of any more categories of flowers. And then we can narrow it down to say pink flowers that are used in Leipo'o. And so then we can say, okay, plumeria, roses, carnations, and so on and so forth. And so this helps us to remember, to recall, and utilize. And we can use it with all kinds of categories. And this is something that our kupuna did before writing was introduced. And then, of course, from that, now we have computers and internet and all these other things. Next, please. Okay, so pina'i is repetition, and this works on different levels. It can include the repetition of sounds. So in Hawaiian, we have less consonants than in English, so we tend to have a lot of repetitive vowel sounds, especially I think is the most repeated or the most used in words. So ka, ma, right, these sounds, but also concepts. So ideas that are repeated, like love and different ways of expressing love besides the word aloha, but also ideas. So this also functions as a memory aid in oral practice to repeat something. Okay, next please. Okay, kana is something that we tend to have heard of when we're talking about mele. It's been described in different ways. So this is a simpler description, right? So it's metaphor that looks at layers of meaning conveyed in a word or a symbol or an idea that conveys different levels of cultural knowledge and insight. in short, it says more than what it is. So one example I always use is a rainbow. So if we ask ourselves, okay, what's a rainbow? Oh, it's when this, light hits water and there's it fractures into these different color bands, right? So that's a dictionary Western scientific definition or description. But if we look at kauna of a rainbow in different contexts, we see in a Christian context, a rainbow appears after the flood and is a promise of God's love that He won't flood the earth anymore in that way, right? It's in the story of Noah and the ark. Um, a rainbow in Hawaiian culture is often the sign of the presence of an ali'i, especially a very important ali'i, and we see it appear a lot in older mo'olelo. That shows that a chief, especially if the rainbow is moving, a chief is traveling, or if it's seen above a valley, the chief is present. And then I teach at UH Manoa, so of course we were, I don't know, I think we are again the Rainbow Warriors, and so the rainbow is important to as our school mascot. And my understanding is that became the mascot when there was a hard fought victory of a football game with Tommy Ka'ulukukui as the quarterback of the time, I think back in the 1920s. And after a long battle, UH was victorious and a rainbow appeared over the football field. And so that was considered a really positive ho'ailona, and why they won. So that's how we became the Rainbow Warriors. Okay, next slide. Okay, ho'onani, to honor or to praise. And this is really important in Mele Inoa because this is why composers compose Mele Inoa, right? Is to praise the subject of the mele. And one category of people that are often praised are leaders, starting, of course, with our ali'i in traditional times. Okay, next. Okay, so maybe are just one element of Mele composition that demonstrate continuity of important Hawaiian cultural practices, thoughts, worldviews, and values across time and across generation. So I'm not saying this is the only thing, and these are not the only maybe. This is just one small slice of what we can look at when we're looking at a Mele, to appreciate the depth of the composer's thoughts. Next. Okay, so maybe like the ones we're going to go over, help to show us today what our kupuna valued when they composed mele, and they can help guide us in what we value today that we either bring down from the past from our kupuna or perhaps new expressions of older values, but also can guide us on what we want to pass on for future future generations and what we'd like them to value as well as Kanaka, or as people who appreciate and want to uphold Kanaka uh, OEV values and practices like dancing to mele, right, hula, and singing mele and composing mele. Next. Okay, so these are 4 examples of mele inoa from different periods we're going to go over tonight, starting with a mele for Kamuali'i. I have specific slides on the backgrounds of each of these, so I'm not gonna stop here right now. We can move forward and go through the mele in this particular order. Okay, next. Okay, so mele inoa no Kamuali'i. Next. Okay, so this translates to name chat, right? Mele Inoa for Kamuali'i. It was composed by his mother, Kamakahele, for her son. She was a Kauai ali'i who reigned on Kauai from 1770 to 1794. Her exact birth date is not quite known. Perhaps she was born somewhere between the 1720s and 1740s, but she was the ali'i of Kauai when Captain Cook arrived in 1778, and then she passed away in 1794. We don't know exactly when this mele was composed. I've been looking and I haven't found anything solid yet. And then, of course, as we know, Kamuali'i became the mo'i, or the king of Kauai, upon his mother's death when he was just 16 years old. Next. Okay, so as far as I've been able to find, it was first published in the Hawaiian language newspaper Kanupepa Ku'oko'a in two parts. So the first part was March 27th, and the second part was on April 4th, 1868. It is 295 lines long, and it is divided into 17 pauku or verses. And from what I've looked at, they're not all the same line lengths, each pauku. They vary from about 9 to 13 lines on average, some a little bit shorter, some a little bit longer. So this is one thing that we can see that's different from when we look at mele from the 19th century forward, that tend to have even number of lines per pauku, sometimes two, three, four. So here we have variation. And one thing that might tell us is that this is the period of chant, where there's a different method of memory and performance than we have with mele, particularly mele that might be accompanied by modern implementation. Um, Okay, and so what I found interesting about this as well is that this mele for Kamwali'i appeared next to a history for Kamehameha or the Kamehamehas by Samuel Kamakau, who's most noted for ruling chiefs. And so, next slide, please. This is a closer look at what the slide you just saw from the newspaper that shows the title here. So it's on the far left column of the first page of the paper, and you can see the numbers there for the different pauku. And then the mo'olelo that's just to the right is the history of the Kamehamehas by Kamakau. And what I find really interesting about that is that Komoali'i was the only ali'i that Kamehameha was never able to conquer by force. He tried twice and two different times never made it to uh, overcome Kauai forces. And so Komoali'i just kind of said, okay, hey, let's, I'll cede Kauai to you once I die. Let me just finish my reign. And he said, okay. So that this mele to celebrate Kamulu'i's heritage is published next to a history of Kamehameha, to me is very ironic. And it kind of shows either a sense of humor by the editors or the writers of the paper, or also, again, that A'olipau Ka'ike Kahalau Ho'okahi. While we're reading about Kamehameha's history, let's not forget about Kamuali'i's history as well. Um, so I think that's very interesting to see that context. So in this mele, what's really interesting to me is that it really doesn't focus on naming Kaumoali'i. It focuses on his paternal ancestry to other islands other than Kauai and Ni'ihau, and chiefly lines through his father Kaeokulani, going back to Kiha'api'ilani of Maui. So Kamakahele reportedly began teaching this lengthy mele inoa to her son Kaumuali'i when he was about 6 years old. Um, and I barely can memorize a grocery list of a few things. So 300, close to 300 lines to me is really an amazing, stunning feat. Um, and many of the maybe that I mentioned are contained throughout this Mele Inoa. It's way too long to go through the entire thing, so I pulled a few excerpts to talk about, just to highlight. And if you're interested beyond this presentation, you can get in touch with me, or we can talk later. Next, please. Okay, so what is marked in the mele as Pauku 12, starting at line 158, is where I'm going to start. In Fornander's Hawaiian Antiquities, Volume 6, he actually takes this mele, breaks it into completely separate mele, and doesn't even publish them next to each other. And in this section, he credits to Kamakahele as a mele inoa for Kamuali'i, but titles it Mele Inoa for Kiha Pi'ilani, who is, of course, Kaumuali'i's illustrious Maui ancestor. So I'm actually going to start well into the middle of the longer mele to look at this. So I was trying to figure out how to do this when I don't have the ability to move my cursor on this screen. So I did different colors that I hope comes through well. So marked in green. So the left is the original Hawaiian that I've added diacritical marks to because it helps me. So if you notice any errors, I apologize. That's all on me, not Ukaheva, for that. Um, and was trying to type quickly, so there might be typos. And then on the right is a translation that I put together. It's a little bit different from Fernandez. So it starts here, Okiha api'i lani, right? Uh, Naming his ancestor, Ihanao Kamaka Alaneo, who's another son in this lineage. Okiha pi'ilani Kamaka Halanalana, um, Ilihalana Lakea Okiha Pi'ilani. E kahuli ho'iha ne ko kiha ili, ko kiha ka hiko I kapa akuai, he ke'o maila, he hemolele ne kauhi, ku kauhi ka hiko I kapa akuai. So right away we see this listing of names. That's Mo'okuauhau. So the Mele Inoa is a Mo'okuauhau that contains the listing of Mo'okuauhau within it. Here, starting with these ancestors of this paternal uh, chiefly line of his father's side, going back to Maui. Um, then we get some of the descriptors of ho'onani and praise. So on line 160 with Kiha Pi'ilani, Kamaka Halanalana is not part of his name, it's an epithet. It's something that describes a positive quality. So here we have a chief with the piercing eyes. Halanalana is also when your eyes overflow like tears, so strong emotion. Um, that's a praising Kihapi'ilani there. We see the description of his skin in different places, starting with Halanalakea, this whitish yellowish, which is a kauna that often describes drinking ava, which is something that chiefs were noted for. Um, this idea in 163, his skin is kahuli, is transforming, and there's a kauna there too of kahuli also overturning, and so with this kahiko, right, this adornment, this dignity, it's alluding to his prowess as a warrior, an ali'i, who was without blemish, right? Ke'o and hemolele, um, perfect. Um, Next slide, please. Okay, so this next section of lines, we come down to Ka'eo Kulani, his father. Again, this idea of the ili, right? Ha'o ha'o, marvelous, wondrous. And then the repetition of the kahuli to ele ele. So ele ele, the color black, is also synonymous with in a kauna reference, not just to sacred and ali'i status, when we think of words like hiva or hiva lani, but also with the marking of the Maui chiefs like Kahikili with the completely black uhi tatau on the skin. So again, referencing through Kauna, warrior, ali'i, ancestry. And then again with Kohikea, um, and then from Kohikea comes Namaka Ikalulu o Kalani. Now, I haven't been able to find this name in any of the genealogies associated with the Pi'ilanis. It's probably or possibly an epithet, like we saw earlier, with Kiha Pi'ilani, translates to the eyes in the calm of the heavens. So this could be a way of referencing the chief, either Kohikea or Kiha Pi'ilani, or one of the lines in a poetic way. Next. Okay, so here we go into kauna with metaphor. So the chief is described as the fish, the Ia, Haki Haki Ia Ike Kiholo, the one that breaks the Kiholo, which is part of the fish pond. And then the next few lines talk about this the fish is struggling, right? The fish is caught on the line and it's jerking. And so then now we reference more names in the genealogy with Kavelo, who is also Makualua here, second father, with Kakuhiheva, which I think is Kakuhiheva, possibly from Oahu. Um, Now, this is important too because we know that uh, when before there was way before there was DNA testing and understanding one's genealogy through scientific means, how did they account for children born from women? And they were really only concerned with chiefly women who might have been sleeping with more than one man and determine who was a father. So one of the ways they did this was to sanction what's called po'olua, two heads. So in this case, the child born can claim both lineages, even though one is only one is possible to be the actual biological father. This was a way that they could satisfy that focus on genealogy is to um, have the child claim two genealogies, which is you know held up their mana even higher. Um, and then we have reference to other names in the genealogy: Kanaloa, Loeva, Pahia, Kaili, Kama, Kaleva Nu'u, Kaleva Lani, may or may not be chiefly named. This is another Ekoa or pairing that we see a lot referencing to the different levels of the sky. The Lani, which also is a metaphoric way through Kauna of talking about the chiefly genealogies. Okay, next, please. Okay, so here we see a bit of a transition, right? So we have Kama and La'aloa is now a child. There's a reference to Kupa Eli, which again is not, it's presented as a personal name, but is referencing the drum, the Pahu drum. And the drums were sounded for the birth of royal children. So here we have that other metaphor, Kauna, referencing this idea of praising him for his lineage, right, through the sound of the drum beats on the Pahu drum. Um, the tapping of the ki halale, again referencing to a drum, but then also having it likened to the sound of a bird, right, the chirping of a bird. Um, and then the reference to the composition of the drum and the reverberation of the drum, right, sounding the birth of the chiefly child, with the ilikalakala, right, the rough skin is the sharp skin head of the pahu drum. Um, and then at the end, Kaleo Kamanu, right, like a voice of a bird, is the sounding of the drum. One of the things that I want you to notice, and we can see that here pretty clearly with the underlying areas as well, is when I talk about pinai and repetition, we see words, we see sounds. So um, starting on the first line, going down, almost all the lines start with O. O ka, o kama, o la'a, ka hua, o ka hua, o kupa, eli eli, eli kupa, ilani, o ka eli eli, o kupa kupa, ka ai, ka hele hele, o ka ai, oi, ai o ki halale, ikani o ki halale. So even between lines there with the ki halale being repeated, Oka ili kalakala ili na kolokolo ku aka ke kani he kani ku pau kolo ka leo o ka manu, right? So that's Pina'i in a snapshot, right? This multiple layering. And when you read it, you can see it. When you hear it, it really stands out. And I'm sure in performance, being chanted and being sung, it adds a rhythm that wouldn't be there if Pina'i was not being utilized. Next, please. Okay, so here we have the sound of the bird in the last section. Now we have the lupo or the cry of Kiva'a, who's uh, a kua, a mythical bird, right, symbolizing power. And then the repetition of Kiva'a, Kiva'a having a kite, Kiva'a, again, kite flying in the heavens, right? Royal symbol. Reference again to Kavelo. And then again, right? Ku Kavelo, Ku Mai Kalani. So Lani is the sky, the heavens, but also the chief. So lots of repetition here. Ku kiha, ku ka kalani, ho'one enu'u, which is a form of the god Ku. And Ku is a warrior god, worshipped by the chiefs and a god of warfare. So all of these repetitions of the idea of Ku to stand, to rise, but also the god Ku. Um, and then that idea of being vertical and upright with the reference to the Pali Kahakoa, the Pali Akula Nali'i, right, the very high cliff for the chiefs that who are inaccessible because their genealogy is so high and so sacred. And then that's repeated, Pali Kahakoa, Pali Akula Iki Kapu, right? So this idea of sacredness. So you'll see a lot of these words that I'm focusing on, like Lani, Kapu, um, continue through the different mele because of their importance in Hawaiian culture and within the mele Inoa. Next, please. Okay, so this last section, a nui ke kapu o kohikea, right? The kapu of kohikea keeps increasing in sacredness because of this genealogy. Um, Kohi Kamalala another part of the genealogy, right? And then this section ends. It's not the end of the chat, but I thought it was a good place to end. We have the O Kamalala in line 203, Kalani Halala Hoa'e Kiali'i, and then Halala Auna Mai Ke Kapu, Auna Mai Ke Kapu, Auna Kamoi Kapu, right? So it's culminating through this genealogy with the deep sacredness of these lani, these chiefs that have the kapu moi, the prostrate kapu, right? The most, one of the more sacred, important kapu. Next, please. Okay, so this is just a very, very short recap, right, of what I went over. So the maybe on the left, we're looking at, right, the mo'oku, how the ekoa or the complementary opposites, helu or listing, pina'i, repetition, kauna, metaphor, symbols, and then ho'onani, the praising element. So this is just a very quick synopsis. Next, please. Okay, so now we're going to look at He Mele Inoa no Kamo'i Wahine Lili'u Kaleni. Next. Okay, so this was composed by Ellen Kekoa Ohiva Kalani Wright Prendergast, who's noted for writing Mele Aikohaku or Kaulana Napua, most of us know. She often composed by her middle Hawaiian name, Kekoa, or signed her Mele, Kekoa Ohiva Kalani. This we do know it was composed at her home, Puahaulani Hale in Honolulu on August 18th, 1898 following the overthrow and the push for annexation and Liliuokalani's trip to Washington, D.C. to fight to get the kingdom restored. So that's the context of this particular mele. Next, please. Okay, so this one was published in the newspaper Kealoha Aina, which was an anti-annexation pro-Liliuokalani newspaper on August 27th of 1898 on page 6. You can see it on the slide on the far left column of that page is the mele. It's 54 lines long, noticeably shorter. And what was interesting to me about this is it's published alongside an excerpt from the Buke Mo'olelo Hawaii, known to us in English as Hawaii's Story by Hawaii's Queen by Liliuokalani, her autobiography, as well as a history of Hawaii. So the Hawaii Story was published in 1898. It was meant to be actually 1897. I always forget because her Kumulipo came out right after. Okay, so this was meant to be, in part, her argument for Hawaii's history and for the restoration of the kingdom, and it itself begins and ends with Mo'okuauhau, which again is very important in our community. So here in the first mele, we have Kamakahele writing or composing a mele inoa for her son, based on his paternal lineage. Here we have a woman who is a noted composer and writer and supporter of the Queen, composing what she's calling a mele inoa for the Queen's political activities going to Washington, fighting for the restoration of Hawaiian sovereignty. Next. Now, as far as I know, this has not been recorded, and there's no ea or tune that I'm aware of. There's a lot of mele that come to us from this period that exist in writing and haven't made it off the uh, page into performance like we see with Kaulana Napua. And my understanding is that there was actually a different tune for that song originally, and then it kind of got lost, and then it was sort of uh, visited around the 1920s or 30s or so. Amy Stillman writes about that. But okay, so here going through the chant, it's very different. You'll see that first line we have part of her name reference, right? Lili'u, which is one of the acceptable nicknames. And we see a lot of ho'onani and listing of Kauna, right? She's the Kuini Kaulana, the renowned queen of the world, right? She's a mohailani. She's a heavenly offering for the people because of her status as the mo'i wahine, right? As the queen. So lani here, both heavenly but also royal. Um, she's the imi pomaikai, right? So here the translation says well-being, but pomaikai is also blessing, right? She's seeking the blessing, the well-being for Hawaii. She's the one alone, right, who's addressed as Kalani, as um, appropriate title for Hawaiian ali'i, right, the royal one. She's gone through the kai ehu ehu ha nupa nupa, right, the turbulent and stormy seas, which is kauna for um, trouble, bad times. Um, she's crossed the Moana Loa, right, the great expanse of the Pacific Ocean, which is the largest geographical feature on the planet. That here they're specific, kind of putting in this 19th century knowledge. We now know in the 19th century it's 2,000 miles wide, right? So they add that there. E lua kau kane mile ka mamau. So we have the loa and the mamau, right? So this great vast expanse. Next, please. Even today, it takes 5 hours by plane to get to the west coast. So back then, by ship, right? It was a huge undertaking. Okay, so here, yet she's very calm and she's in control as a good leader should be, right? Ole iho po iho ko manao. You're not even bothered at all. Um, And here we see this idea starting again of aloha, right? So we have pomaka'i, we have aloha. Line 14, we have i'ini, right? Desire. All of these positive ideas. Line 19, kahai aloha, right? Our beloved flag of our nation. And this is when we start getting flag quilts and hat bands. And this has been revived a little bit last year with the kukia imauna and the use of the flags, and the Hawaiian flag in particular is harkening back to this era where the flag became a really important symbol of Hawaiian nationhood. And then going back up to line 14, here we have a different rendering of her name, right? Lili'ulani Ike Kapu, or the royal Lili'u of the sacred, of the Kapu, the lineages that hold Kapu. Like we saw with Komuali'i, right? This reference to the different types of Kapu. And then again, like with line 9, right? O'ole iho po iho, right? She's not at all worried in line 15, male ole kahana na enemy, right? What the enemies are doing, the Americans in Congress trying to pass annexation, that's nothing, right? Because she's in control and she's got her dignity. But it's nothing because of no ke aloha iko oneha. Now, because of your love for the sounds of your birth, right? So this is kauna for Hawaii. And some of these should trigger different mele for you. So every time I hear ko oneha now, ku oneha now, I immediately think of Hawaii aloha. Um, E Hawaii e kuneha nau e, right? And so it's all about that. And so this, I think, is echoing that sentiment that we, as the Lahui, the Hawaiian people, we have this deep love for our oneha now. Um, and then in line 18, right, a na'i is also to conquer, right, the kapono, the justice for the land, right, when restoration of sovereignty. And we're going to see several different ways pono is translated in this mele when it appears. Um, and then line 21, the uila hemo ole, um, this is the lightning bolt. So again, a royal sign, a ho'ailona, a kauna, the lightning from the sky is representing in the Leni, representing the Ali'i as well. So she's also a lightning bolt of action and energy, um, with a pu'uvai kapu, right, with a sacred heart that belongs to her, again being addressed as Kalani, right, her, Your Majesty. Next, please. And then this reference to the ua and the makani, the troubles that we see earlier, right? That rain and wind. And then this shift, right? Pu ku'i ke anu me ke ko'e, right? Huddled in the cold and the chill. Now she's in Washington, where it's the hao ho'ikonyo wakinikona, right? So the snow in Washington that's so cold, it chills the bones. I've been there, done that. It's incredibly intense. Um, Eniki Kaili Mehipola, right, nipping at the skin like a lover. And we have this reference again to Ili, that we see the skin. Different context though, right, with Kamwili Ismele. And then the shift of season. She's there so long that first it's the chilling cold and now it's the stifling heat. Okala, Kikiki, Vela, Okiko, Ko being the season, right? The summer season. And then Nonono, the glowing red color is referring to the blush on her cheeks. And Nonono, the color red, Ula, all of these are also referencing sacredness and Ali'i heritage as well. Um, and then we hear in line 30, Kamakanioho, Ikavele Laulima, the gentle breeze of the fingertips, right? So even though it's really hot and oppressive and making her flush, that, now we have a gentle breeze instead of the stormy wind, that provides relief. And again, here, right, with the translation, I think of her mele, Malamba, make a gentle breeze waft my neck, right? So that idea of this very pleasant experience. Um, and then talking about the Aina Malihini, right? This land of strangers that is a ko'a back to the ko'one hanao, right? This beloved sounds of the birth. And then here, because she's looking for pono and justice this time. Next, please. Okay, so she goes before Congress, and there's some really, to me, interesting little descriptors of the senators as with the pihi lole lole, or these disheveled buttons. I'm not sure if just because maybe their suits are frumpy, or a lot of people wear political buttons. If they may be discussing that. Um, but this idea that they're polole ole on the kauliki, or consensus, right? They're being unjust with the pono here, the rights now of the Hawaiian people, looking for lokahi, right? Unity from uh, the mana nui o Amelika, right? This great authority and power. And so then line 43, there's a shift to the e ana e ho'i o muhe'e, right? The schooling cuttlefish appear, and cuttlefish are a predator, right? Intermediary predator in the ocean. Nahoa o Kahale Aho'olelo, members of the legislature, Ku e Kumu Kanavai, who are opposing their own constitution, right? So they're being pono'ole, polole ole, unjust. Um, and she's noting in this belly, right, the hypocrisy in not uh, supporting the queen and the injustice that was done. And it's interesting because we see some of this action today uh, in Congress with the Constitution. So, that would be interesting to see if anyone wanted to write a melee about what's happening today in Congress. Okay, next slide, please. All right, so towards the end, right, again, this repetition of these ideas of Lokahi for the Lahui, looking to Kahaku Manoloa, one of the names for God, right, our Almighty God. We have line 50, Keola, translated as salvation, right? Ola is life, salvation is restoration of life. And then we end with these Christian images because Lili Okalani was a devout Christian. So here with discussion of the Kahikolu, the Holy Trinity, the idea of Lanakila, victory in this fight. So she's being positioned as a warrior for the people, for justice, kind of a David versus Goliath when you look through the Mele. And then Ha'ina Kapuana Oko Inoa. The story is told through your name. And what is her name? Lili'u Ololo Kulani Ike Kapu, right? Lili'u Ololo Kulani of the sacred. So even though this Mele doesn't give her genealogy, it references in the first and last lines and in the middle to her genealogy that in the new paper we could look at the Mo'olelo right there, Hawaii story. Many people knew her genealogy, especially with coming out of Kumulipo by Kalakaua, her brother, in Hawaiian, and then with her undertaking of the translation of Kumulipo. So again, this idea of genealogy, even in the late 19th century period, during the afterthrow, which was partly how Emma lost the election of 1874 is because of a contest of genealogy. Even after the overthrow and during annexation discussions to make Hawaii part of the US, where genealogy doesn't matter in this kind of way, and royalty certainly doesn't matter because the US was founded on breaking away from monarchy and had the government leaders of her time through now have very negative views of monarchy because of the US history with Great Britain. Um, that this is still of utmost importance to our kupuna of that time and one of the values that gets handed down to us today with the idea of mo'okuauhau. Next slide, please. Okay, so again, this is just a very quick recap. So mo'okuauhau, right, the mele itself is, and it's really an allusion to through the use of her name that you either have to know it or you have to go and look it up. So it's presented in a counted way. There's the Ikoa or the dyads of opposite of Hawaii versus Washington, the hot summer, the cold winter, right? The land of the strangers versus our Ku'uone Hanau, the fight for Pono and the Ku'e, right? Or not uh, siding with the Constitution, and then like her calm response to the very stressful situation. Helu, we see recounted over and over. The uh, Pono, aloha, praise for the queen. Pina'i, her bravery, her love, her faith in God and in the people. Kauna, right, the reference to Muhe'e. The Pihe is Lole Lole, not Lohe Lohe, that's a typo. The turbulent seas, winds, and rains as trouble that she encounters. The lightning bolt as another type of heavenly symbol of her royalty. And then Ho'onani, the praise, calling her Your Majesty, using the epithet Ike Kapu, right, in the sacred, calling her the Queen Kaulana o Kahunua, right, the famous queen of the earth. Next, please. Okay, so now we're getting, there's a few people who've already commented, even with writing the article. What does Barack Obama have to do with this? He's not Hawaiian. Um, he has a Mele Inoa. And so we're going to play that for you in just a moment, or I think now. If you, I'll take a break from talking, and you can listen to the Mele, and then we'll talk about it.
Mahalo everyone for tuning in again. Dr. Kualoha Ho'omanawa Nui, whatever information that you shared with us this evening, it was like unbelievable. We were taking notes here. And one of the interesting parts, and I'm just going to share this, just because we're having a little difficulties with the sharing of the mele, but you shared one part of the Kamwali'i Mele, and there's one part that said Pi'ilani, or Pi'ilani was mentioned in there. And so that brought me to the song Navili Vili, which was composed by Uncle George Manoa Hari, and in the third verse it says Kekania o Pi'ilani, and so I was just like, wow, this maybe there's a connection here, and this is how with this we can connect to all of these other songs or chants out there that would bring us to ease, or to understanding what these different mele, because sometimes we don't know everything because the composer is not here, as well as the translation as well. And so this is so interesting, and I hope all of you viewers out there are taking notes as well, and taking it in and being inspired and encouraged to do it. Okay, so let us enjoy this beautiful mele.
Thank you. Thank you. My fellow citizens, I stand here today humbled by the task before us. Grateful for the trust you've bestowed, mindful of the sacrifices borne by our ancestors. The time has come to set aside childish things. The time has come to reaffirm our enduring spirit, to choose our better history, to carry forward that precious gift, that noble idea passed on from generation to generation, the God-given promise that all are equal, all are free, and all deserve a chance to pursue their full measure of happiness.
Okay, I'm back, I think. Yep. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so this Mele was Kanio o Malaka'ailana, translates to the pinnacle of the United States. Malaka'ailana, or America, the island of America, was composed by Manu Boyd and Horace K. Dudois III and included on their CD Nani Mauloa, which came out in 2009. And I believe they won a Hoku for this, if I remember correctly. And, it kind of makes me sad that this isn't one of their really well-known songs, because it's really a little gem all into itself. I would hope, I don't know if anyone has composed hula for it. I would hope so. It would be, I think, kind of interesting to see. And next slide, please. All right. If you could make it bigger so I could see it again. Thank you. Mahalo. Okay. It's really beautiful in the way that it is crafted in the poetic imagery, um, where we have a Obama has often been called the son of Hawaii, right? Kama'aina, a child of the land, and he's not Hawaiian. But we also know that Hawaiians we compose. We have non-Hawaiians that compose mele and olelo Hawaii and dance hula and our kumuhula and seo va'a and all kinds of stuff, right? A lot of us are mixed ancestry nowadays as well. So non-Hawaiians are our ohana, our friends, our parents, our children, family, so on and so forth. And so this is a way that the composers were I think using this idea of a Mele Inoa in a new way for someone who's not Hawaiian, but also it's not the first or only time. There are many Mele Inoa for non-Hawaiians across the centuries. I just really liked this particular one and thought it was very timely. So we started with uh, a Mele Inoa composed in the late 1700s, and then we went to a Mele Inoa composed in the late uh, 19th century, right? 1998. And then we come to a mele composed around 2008, right into the 21st century. So there's things I'm pointing out that show the continuity. And then with this mele in particular, I think we see some of the differences. Um, Here, there is no reference to his mother or his father in this mele. For me, where the Mo'okuau house shows up is in line 2, Maluhia i kapuhala hinano o kapunaho, right? So Maluhia protected by, right, in the piece of the puhala hinano, the hala trees at Kapunaho, which is Punaho School, his alma mater. Actually, where my dad graduated from too, at Punaho. And so this is a special place for me. I went to Kapa'a on Kauai. Yay, go Warriors. But Manoa campus for UH is very close to where Punahou School and campus resides. And that is a very important place where our schooling is important, where we sometimes live, like students who board at Kamehameha or Lahaina Luna or before Mid Pacific Institute. Now I don't think they have boarding anymore. Um, for all the years that we spend studying and our formative years, what we learn. And so for me, this is a genealogy, not so much of his kupuna and ancestry, but of the Ike that formed him and his values and his time in Hawaii. And then in line 3, we have reference to his grandmother, who helped to raise him, right? Or his grandparents, right here, grandmother. Um, and so these ideas, right, in the first line, he's Kale Kaumaka Kama Aina. So that's the identity marker there. It's not Native Hawaiian, it's child of the land, which it extends to non Hawaiians in different ways. Sometimes the children of missionaries born here, like those at Punahou School when it started in the 1840s, gave themselves the label of Kama'aina to distinguish themselves from both Native Hawaiians as well as from their parents uh, who were not born or raised, grow up in Hawaii. They became a Kama'aina generation that, to them, distinguished them between both in good and maybe bad ways too. Um, but that is an important distinction there when we talk about people as kama'aina, not just being born or raised here, but having certain kinds of values, things like we talk about aloha or malama'aina, ohana, right? These are important when we talk about of that. So the kauna, right, the le kaumaka kama'aina, he's the one who's held in high regard as a child, right, who's sheltered by the hala trees, themselves having a lot of kauna in Hawaiian culture in different ways. The hi'ile aloha, the mili mili, right, the favored one, beloved child of the grandparents. So that tie to the elders, the kupuna. Um, Hanai ia a pa'a me ka ike ku pono, right? So raised with good values and insights from family as well as from his schooling. Next, please. Okay, and so in the chorus, we have the ho'onani, the praise, right? Hano hano Hawaii kalono, right? Hawaii is honored by the news. Again, if we're gonna start alluding to other mele, what comes to mind is Helen Dishe Beaver's Wyomina, where Ikua Purdy or Chikawawa and Evan Lowe go to Wyoming and win the Cheyenne Rodeo Days, and so we have the same imagery that Beamer uses to talk about that, right? When Hawaii hears the news. Wakao eke kama, right? So here kama, both child, but also referencing kama'aina, ikani'o. This uh, young child, this little keiki from little Hawaii, has become ascended to the heights of Malaka Ailana, right? The United States. So this is a koa, and it's a huge, huge accomplishment that I'm not sure anybody thought was even possible because we're such a small population that's so far away from not just physically from the U.S., but from the seat of power in Washington, D.C., and in this capacity. Next, please. Okay, so here again, right, we have some of the similar imagery that we see with Lili'u Kalani's Mele, and also we see the resonance between two um, people with political leadership uh, going to the nation's capital of the U.S. Right. So here, I think in that her melo alo, right, the dodging of trouble. Right here, it's the in her mele it was the wind and the rain. Here it's the violent storms and the chilling northwest winds. Right, the makani Q, all kauna for troubles. And then as well, right, the anu ko'e ma ele ele o na lihi akau, right? So the bitter cold winds of the north, which I think is also alluding to Chicago, where he became the senator first. And I've been to Chicago in January. It is very, very, very cold. Um, and then that's contrasted, right, the ikoa with the ho'opumihana ikapuliki o kealoha, the warmth of love, right, or the puliki and the loving embrace with his family, right? So the lei, so he's described as a lei kaumaka, right, this cherished lei. Now we have na lei, uilani, makamai, the cherished beauties, right, to his wife Michelle and his daughters Sasha and Malia, and Malia's name too, right? Connecting back to this Aina as a Hawaiian name. So there's all these juxtapositions here with the Ekoa through the Kauna and this lei metaphor, which is very important for us, right? And with different types of lei that have different types of meanings. And one is the children are cherished. There are lei. Um, and so he's described as that as a child that his grandparents raises, and then his children are described as Nale Ui Makamai, right, in the same way. So we have that generational description going down that we can see as a type of counted Mo'okuauhau, not referring to his ancestors, but here, in a way, he's the ancestor for this next generation coming down as these beloved lay. Next, please. Okay, so more of the ho'onani, right? Hie lua ole, no one can compare to his kulana, right? His status, his presence of the alaka'i. He's a leader. That's kind of a generic term. He's not a li'i, right? He's not a mo'i. That's important, I think, to point out. So that's one of the differences. We're in a different political situation with the U.S. governance now than from the Hawaiian governance, but also he's not elite status. He doesn't come from that genealogy. So I think that's important to note the use of words there. But then this is important. The next line, 16, he ali'i nui leo olu olu vale mai no, right? That if we take this all together, this is a way of describing leaders that are considered kind and highly valued, right? They treat the people well. So this idea of okuali'i, to have the stomach of a chief, the you can't, to me, really separate Ali'i, Nui, Leo Olu Olu, right? The one who has a pleasant voice, not just for how it sounds, but in how he speaks to people, about people, and so on and so forth. And then again, ho'onani, right? Kau keha keha ikawele lau o kahonua. So like with Lili Okalani, who was the Queenie Kaulana o kahonua, right? The famous queen of the world. Here we have his uh, leadership extends and is known, right, throughout the world as the American president. And then now we also have this modern context, Christian context. We also see with Lilu Okulani that brings in Kiapua Leni, right, the Heavenly Father here. All these different ways to express references to God that we've seen in her last mele and then in this one to, ma lama mau, right, to always, kia ia ma lama mau, to protect and always guide is important in our modern um, culture, right? And with our mele as well. Next, please. Okay, and so here again we have the repetition of that idea of aloha, right? And we'll see that in the next mele too. And then lastly, right, the pelike kena e kaulana ne, right? So like with Lili'u, who is the Queenie Kaulana, the famous president of the United States. And so here again, right, kauna and poetry, Malaka Ailana, we come from islands. So rather than um, literally translating it, the composers have view America, the U.S. as another island, right? And sometimes we hear that expressed as mokuhono, um, Turtle Island, which is a way that different Native American peoples describe the continental U.S. Next, please. So again, just a quick summary, right? So the Mo'okuahau is not his actual ancestral genealogy, but this idea of Ike, right, through school and a metaphorical connection to genealogy of knowledge. Ikoa, right, the dyads of the Kama'aina to Ni'o, right, the being U.S. president, the cold, stormy, inhospitable weather to the warmth of love and family. So again, back to like Ohana and Hawaiian values. The list of Helu, right, good values, morals, insights is loved. Pina'i, repetition, ideas of pride, respect, love, celebration. Kauna with the imagery of the Le Kaumaka Kama'aina, Kani'o, and even Malaka Ailana, how that's described. And then Ho'onani with the Hano Hano Hawaii Kalono and the Pelikinia Kaulana. Okay. So lastly, Maka just brought this short mele to my attention the other day, and I thought it would be a nice way to just kind of wrap it back up um, to this idea of our royal ali'i. And actually, if you could you go to the next slide before we play the mele. Um, so this is He Mele no Lili'u o Kalani, a song for Lili'u o Kalani. And it's not a Mele Inoa per se, but I thought it's a nice contemporary mele that's still in our time period. Composed by Moon Kawakahi in 2015, the CD liner notes say it was composed as an olikahea for a retreat on Maui for the Queen Lili'u o Kalani Children's Center. Now they're the Lili'u o Kalani Trust. And it was recorded on the CD Ele Ho'i E Lili Ulani E Lili Ukulani Music for and by the Queen um, by various artists in 2019. And what is really interesting when I looked at this, it's the only mele on the CD composed for the Queen. The rest are mele composed by the Queen and sung beautifully by a number of artists. And it's available on their website on onipa'a.org, and you can get free download or listen to it free there. So anyways, this is going to take us to the end of this presentation. So you could go to the next slide, please. Okay, this is really short, and we played the last mele without seeing the words, but this is the whole mele here. The first three lines are repeated for lines 5, 6, 7, and then line 8 replaces line 4. And anyways, it kind of will make sense as as we go through, and then we'll talk about it after. So whenever you guys are ready, we can play this mele.
Go back to the first page.
Okay, mahalo. So, um, beautifully done. It was done as an ole kahea originally, and I think they said they added a ea to it to turn it into a little bit more of a mele, and that introduces the rest of the CD collection of the Queen's mele, and she was a really beautiful composer as well. So here we see the Pina'i repetition with the first line, eo mai, eo mai, eo mai. That repetition of sound continues into the next line with the ea mako, mamo. So we had a lot of a and ma sounds here. Um, Again, this is not a described as a mele inoa, but we have Liliu Lani reference. And you notice too, everybody references her name poetically a little bit differently. Liliu Lani, Liliu Oka Lani, Liliu. And these are all acceptable. And when names get shortened and changed like that, often it very much demonstrates affection, right? We do that with great affection and love for somebody special and important to us. So the next line, number 2, Eamako na mamo o liliulani, right? These are the descendants, but mamo is kauna. It's when we think of imagery, it's the mamo bird from which yellow feathers were plucked to make featherwork for the highest ranking ali'i. And we are the little mamo birds that are still here from Lili'uokalani's time to this time. And I think I would imagine more specifically, the mamo are those of the Queen's Trust, right? The children, the beneficiaries over time, as well as sort of kauna to all the Hawaiian children that have come down from that time. And then we see that imagery that we've already seen with her in particular that comes through. We see much more warrior imagery in the Mele Inoa for Kamuali'i because that was how to be a strong ali'i of his time. And he comes from a long line of very successful, illustrious warriors. And then that shifts in the 19th century where Lili'uokalani, especially embracing Christianity, becomes a leader of peace. And so we see Aloha Maluhia, the reference with Keakua. So here again, right? Imauno, Kamaluhia, will, may that peace always, Imauana. We think too like our Kamehameha III's motto, Ua Mau Ke'ea o Ka'aina Ikapono, the life of the land continues through justice, right? Uh, not just righteousness or belief in God, but through justice when the right thing is done and the stolen governance is returned. Um, and so then in line 4, me ke aloha aho nui, right? Patient love. And then the first line repeats again. So we have repetition, not just within the line, but repeated again in the next pauku, eomai, eomai, eomai. And then line 10, eamako, it's the same as line 2, but now the naumamo has changed to napua mai ole o lili ulani. So here now we're the flowers, the never fading flowers, which shows up in other mele, right? The descendants, kalana napua, right? So we are in one, the imagery, we're the little elegant forest birds that are precious. And then we're the flowers that never fade, right, as descendants. So this poetic imagery. And then in line 3, e mau no kamaluhia, right, that repeats again as line 11. And then instead of me ke aloha nui, we have in line 4. In line 8, we have mai Hawaiia ni'ihau, right? So from Hawaiia ni'ihau, we have Iko'a, all the islands from one end of the archipelago to the other. We go from Hawaii to Ni'ihau as well because the sun rises in the east. So the easternmost point of our land base is Kumukahi in Puna. And we go all the way west to, oftentimes not even Ni'ihau, past Ni'ihau to Kaula. Sometimes Lehua, even though it's slightly closer to us on Kauai than Ni'ihau. But this idea of from the very easternmost point to the very westernmost point and all of us in between on all of these islands, right? So it's a way of saying everybody on all of our islands is included. And then in line 12, right, instead of the Aloha Ahunui, now we have the Malama o Keakua, right? We are cared for by Keakua, right, God. And then the last line, Aloha is, kind of a general like greetings, but they translated this as love, peace, and harmony to all. So we don't see all of that contained in the line Aloha but that's what the composer is meaning, right? That all of us, and here we have that idea of helu and pina'i within the translation, love, peace, harmony, and that gets repeated throughout the mele as well. One last thing that I want to point out before we can go into questions or comments, if we still have some time left, is also that in the calling with the AO and with the addressing of Lili'u in the last mele as well, or Lili'u Lani, it's interactive, right? So we're not just talking to ourselves as the composers, and we're not just talking to our audience, but we're talking to the subjects of our mele. And I think that's very important, that interactive nature, that just because our kupuna have passed, just because someone has passed, or maybe they're not born yet, maybe they're a future generation waiting to be born, that we still acknowledge that as part of our continuity and our ancestry because of our cultural ideas of ohana and how we are embraced by our aina, which is not just the land, right? It's the environment, it's the land from the mountains to the sea, it's the ocean to the greatest depths, it's the sky, right? The lani, the heavens, and everything out there, and that through all of this together, right, we're part of this sense of ohana with the aina, with one another, with all of the elements. And that is one of the things that we see reflected in our mele. This was just a really, really tiny little introduction with a couple of short mele that I thought fit the theme of this year's Mokihana Festival. So, mahalo nui loa.
Mahalo nui, ku'aloha, ho manawa nui. Yay, everybody, that was great. I miss you.
I miss you guys too.
And this inspires us, with all of these information that you have shared, with the different types of poetry that were displayed in each mele. And it's just amazing with even having the composers contest and what Uncle Nathan then wanted to inspire people to compose music of now. And, hearing these different facts about composing and what each person had penned in each word and what they meant is just amazing. And so I want to encourage, everybody out there in Hawaii land, in the world to, compose. You were talking about having a hula hoping somebody does a hula for that mele, President Barack Obama's kalabai. And, that mele was really cool. And we had a comment that it was like, wow, that's a beautiful mele. And so, a lot of times if you don't download the CD or purchase the CD, you won't hear it unless somebody requests it on the radio station. And I believe today that song is going to go, what? I know. And, people are going to, comment on it, whether they like it or not. But you know what? It is what it is. And it tells of our history. And so I want to mahalo you for sharing these interesting facts about these compositions. And there are many out there. And these are just little pieces that with hopes you out there would go out and research. Do these research as Dr. Ku'aloha has done for us. And, then we'll get smarter.
And we can appreciate the poetry more than we already do.
Polole, aye. So, each year, this is really cool. Mele Foundation board members selects a theme each year. This year is Kamakahiki o na Ali'i Hawaii, sorority of Hawaii. And so all of the things that we do, we tend to focus on our ali'i and bringing these educational pieces, such as to this evening, to our community. So, what a great way to end our presentation. He mele no lili'u o kalani. That mele, along with other beautiful mele of Elei Ho'i, e lili'u lani e, can be heard by visiting onipa'a.org. So onipa'a.org. and it's written right there on the screen. So please take some time and go visit their website. We pray everyone enjoyed this awesome presentation with Dr. Kualoha Ho'omanawanui on E Mauana Kapuana Mele Inoa, continuing Mele Inoa traditions. I want to send a special aloha to you all who's joining us this evening. Also, aloha to Mr. and Mrs. Bradshaw. We miss and love you very much. We're looking at the comments. There's, I don't believe we have questions out there that came in, but what we would do is, if you have any questions, you can put it on a prayer list.
Can I just saw that there's the comments. I didn't notice earlier. So I just
Yeah.
want to say aloha to my cousin Jill Chow and my niece Kawanoi, Kili Homanabnui, and Auntie Pua, Nani Rogers. Hi, everybody, and everybody else.
Yeah. Anything you want to say to close our presentation?
Just mahalo nui, oko pakaia pau. This is so important, and I'm glad that the switch to virtual was possible, and to continue our practice and appreciation of our Hawaiian culture and language.
Aye. And also respect it as well. Yeah.
Yes,
Aye.
absolutely.
So, if you do have any questions, you can actually find Dr. Kualoha on Facebook. You can message her. You would have to pule because she doesn't go under Kualoha. You gotta find her. you know. But it's all good, and it's a perfect name for her on her Facebook, Kumu Kumu. It's a confirmation of what she does and what she knows. So mahalo nui again. Tomorrow, the Mele University, so we created the Mele University, was created to help fulfill the Mele Foundation's mission of offering education, educating workshops and lectures of our Hawaiian culture. Tune in tomorrow with the Mele University sharing vignettes posted throughout the day of interesting facts of Kauai. The first video will be posted at 8 a.m. and every hour thereafter. Mahalo, mahalo ho kako. Be safe, be blessed, and wear your mask. Aloha and God bless. Hui ho.